we can both agree that the two driving forces, and they are certainly very closely related, but money, as far as region is concerned, we talk about a market like LA. Certainly that, I think, maybe the biggest part of this. And then you combine that with the fact that the rich history and potential of both USC and UCLA, specifically with USC right now with Lincoln Riley and Caleb Williams and what they've got brewing down there. But I guess my question to you is, if you threw the media market and you took off we don't even look at AAU and the academic standards, if you had to rank 3 items in order based upon most important or least important, in your opinion, when it comes to conference realignment, 1 being potential of a program, 2 being history of a program, or 3 being the recent success, like in Oregon, who's had recent success nationally, but may not have the history of a Washington. How would you differentiate those 3? What do you perceive to be most important and least important?
Well, for football, you know that it goes up and down. I mean, we've seen Alabama be the top of the, food chain here for now over 10, 12 years. When did he get there? 2008, 2009 or whatever?
Yeah.
They started winning. I mean, but before that, they weren't winning, right? It was Texas that was amazing, right? It was USC. And so there's an ebb and flow. Even with the Blue Bloods, there's an ebb and flow. And so I think recent success is important, but I think, maybe over a decade, you want to kind of look at more, instead of maybe the 2 or 3 year, 5 year window. I mean, look at Oregon, for example. In the 10-year window, Oregon has been to the national championship. But if you look at after it happened in the national championship, during the Mark Helfrich era, they looked terrible, right? And they only had the 4-win season. So, recency bias would say, well, then they're not that good of a program. They're on the way out. Well, they rebuilt it with Cristobal and whatnot, and they rebounded and they put themselves back in the position that they should be in now, and they're trending up. I think they look really good going forward. So, it's kind of like that risk reward play. I do think history kind of matters, not too much. But, think about Notre Dame, right? Notre Dame has been here and there successful. They had the Manti Te'o year. Last year they had a pretty good run for a while. But they haven't really been anything since Rocket Ishmael. I mean, seriously. And it's been a while. And they're running. And I'm a Catholic school kid. Trust me, I like Notre Dame. But Notre Dame is again, if you would have asked me 20 years ago what brand name is getting smaller over the years and has less cachet, I would say it's Notre Dame, right? Less Catholics in the country. It's the old school Newt Rockne era. It's farther and farther and farther away. And, this is not necessarily the thing that you would think would have the most success, the biggest brand. Well, now it looks like Oregon's comparing themselves right now to Notre Dame as they're knocking on the door at the same time to get into the same party. The same party, by the way, that has asked Notre Dame numerous times over the year to join their party. They've never even thought of asking Oregon. And to be honest, I really don't know if they had any thought of asking the LA schools. I think the LA schools went to them and said, hey, this is what we should do. Because, how I look at it is through the media. ESPN took over the SEC, and Fox took over the Big Ten. And when Fox took over the Big Ten, it felt like, Fox has really tried to make a name for themselves in Los Angeles. And you have this situation where now they've got a hub there. Now they've got 2 schools there. So it's really kind of it goes back to your first question with my first reaction. I feel kind of bad the fact that these TV executives are running college football at this point. And then you want to talk about, so you talk about what history, where a program's going, the strength of the program, adding to it. I think the biggest thing is numbers. I think numbers matter. How relevant is the program? How many eyeballs have been on this program? Look at Oregon. Oregon has had humongous games. Over the last 10 years, they've had eyeballs on them. That first game against Cam Newton was the largest cable television program in history. I mean, Oregon's had eyeballs on them. For a small school in a very remote area, they've come to play at the national stage. At the right
winning
time.
last year at Ohio State.
Winning last year at Ohio State. It's just the fact is they just have not cashed in on that national championship. Now, I am a big believer that a national championship is great. Don't get me wrong. But a week afterward, you got to put the helmets back on and do it again next year. And if you're Clemson and you finally broke through the glass ceiling and you're awesome, what happens in the next 5 years? Dabo leaves. It goes back to Wake Forest. Because Clemson had plenty of years like that. So, it just, if you're looking at a team to join your conference, you have to be very, very cognizant of the fact that it's going to go up and down. What's the floor and what's the ceiling? I think Oregon has a very high ceiling, and I think they have a pretty high floor. I mean, Oregon's worst season in the last 20 years has been the 4-win season. There's teams that have 4 wins every year. I mean, and they're hanging on, too, to the conferences. So I really like Oregon's shot. Even if all hell breaks loose and they don't get to the Big Ten, or they have to rebuild the Pac-12, or they have to play in the Mountain West, I don't know. I think Oregon football will be fine.
Want to take a minute to thank our sponsor, Ascent Nutrition, and their mold and mycotoxin-free coffee. Get one of these bags. Did you know that most coffees actually contain mold and mycotoxins? This stuff is pesticide-free. It tastes great. It's clean. Order it at goascentnutrition.com. That's goascentnutrition.com, and use the code on your screen, Hawkeyes. Use the code Hawkeyes at checkout to receive 10% off your total order from Ascent Nutrition. And let me just say this, the reason I bring up that question, Ryan, specifically regarding what's most important from a football competitive standpoint, is I think it's clear that USC, even if you're right that this was completely prompted by those 2 LA schools, USC and UCLA check at least 2 of those boxes. They check the potential boxes, they check the history boxes, and certainly the media markets. We've talked about that, and we're not even discussing that specifically, but they check those, they blow those out of the water. Notre Dame, you could argue, again, UCLA and USC has not really had the recent success compared to their standards, especially USC. It's not like USC hasn't been winning games, but from a national power perspective, they're not what you would expect from a USC Trojans program. Notre Dame, I would argue, even though you maybe imply that they've lost some cachet, I still think there's a lot of mystique around that program, and that mystique, even for younger recruits, is appealing. And, of course, you have head coaching changes at USC and Notre Dame to boot. So I just wonder about that, because I think those 3 schools, UCLA, USC, and Notre Dame, check far more boxes than Oregon and Washington. But you brought up some of the rich history of Washington, the recent success of Oregon. I think it's a decent media market. I don't know where it ranks. I think you brought up on your segment that you recorded that there may be like top 20, top 25, but you brought up Portland. I mean, who else owns Portland if it's not Oregon? It ain't Oregon State.
Well, and again, I think that, I don't know exactly how I was kind of looking at how the media kind of portrays those media markets. I would say, yes, that Oregon carries a much bigger number. I would say Oregon's basic footprint goes all the way from the Bay Area all the way up to Seattle, because they get a lot of Northern California kids. Historically, it used to always be called University of California at Eugene. So the ideology was it's always had a big presence in Southern California, Northern California, up and down the West Coast, all over the West Coast, in throughout the other parts of the country. Oregon has created some buzz around its program. Oregon was one of those schools that was the most played on the video games or whatever, and they have the most, some of the highest numbers for social media, Twitter or Instagram or any of that sort of stuff. Which, again, I think all matters when you're putting the money into it and you're investing in a brand. And you're right. I think that if you compare Oregon to UCLA to USC or Notre Dame, they're 4th place, right? They don't compare. They just don't. They don't have those kind of history, budget, the level of success, amount of students. I mean, Oregon's 20,000 kids. So go back to the media market. I know Eugene for a fact is bigger than other schools that are even in the Big Ten, where they're at their actual location. Now you look at the media market as where does it connect to the other larger city near it. So that's why we say, well, Portland's top 25 media market Seattle's probably top 15, and but downtown Seattle is where University of Washington is. I mean, they've got lakefront property in downtown Seattle, major metropolitan city. Eugene is 2 hours away from Portland. Yes, it probably carries the whole Portland market, but so do the Blazers. The Trailblazers have the same kind of footprint where it's the whole Northwest. So, but I do think, though, competitively wise, I think Oregon is, if not as good, they're better than both USC and UCLA. In the last 10 years,
right now,
both of them handedly, yes, and consistently. Even though they're great teams, that's a big win for Oregon whenever Oregon can get that win. But they've shown up and won those games. And I would say that Oregon is basically nationally kind of at the same level that Notre Dame is. If they win and have a great season and don't get that second loss, they're talked about in the national championship conversation, both of them. So,
True.
And I don't know if other schools out here have that sort of cachet immediately. I know Washington might, because they were in the conversation. They played Bama in the CFP. So again, I would hate to see it be that Notre Dame would have a seat at the table and they look for one more from the Pac-12 and just siphon off one. It would be tough for us to leave Oregon State and to leave Washington and go into this league where our closest rival is Los Angeles or Nebraska. That'd be weird. And
I think to wrap this segment of the conversation, because I've got one more question for you, Ryan, but to wrap this segment up, I think to me, it's clear that there is a hierarchy, a totem pole, so to speak, right now. And you've got USC, UCLA, Notre Dame collectively at the top as far as the priorities. UCLA and USC are obviously off the board. After those those three schools, I think Miami, Florida State, and Clemson are certainly right there. I don't know, I don't know that they're a player. I don't know any of those three schools are players for the Big Ten at this point. I expect those schools to be pushed for by the SEC in time. That's just kind of an assumption I guess I've made, and I know others have as well. And then after that, to me, I've been on the record and said very clearly that I think Oregon and Washington are the best brands in the country. And Washington, you brought up the history of Washington, but I think Oregon's the best brand in the country after those other schools. And Washington makes sense to add that second northern school from out west. I mean, you could look at North Carolina, but do you split North Carolina up from Duke? I know there have been rumors today about Stanford. But again, I think Oregon, Washington are the best brands available. And then after that, you've got a slew of schools. Stanford, Utah, I think could be in the conversation. They've had some recent success. You can go out east to the ACC and look at a Georgia Tech because of their market and whatnot. But great conversation. I appreciate your perspective, Ryan.